Hedorah. A year before Gigan ever drew blood, an alien sludge monster nearly drowned Godzilla in his own acid. Hedorah crash-landed on Earth from the dark gas nebula and immediately began feeding on industrial pollution, growing larger and more dangerous with every factory smokestack and oil tanker it consumed. The creature's name comes directly from Hedorah, the Japanese word for sludge or chemical ooze, and the film built around it was explicitly conceived as an environmental parable rather than a straightforward monster movie. A decision that made Godzilla vs. Hedorah one of the more divisive entries in the entire Showa catalog at the time, even as later critics and fans came to see it as one of the more genuinely bold ideas the series ever attempted. Its early forms were pathetic enough that Godzilla trounced it without much effort, but Hedorah kept evolving mid-film, first into a quadrupedal shape, then into a flying saucer capable of spraying sulfuric acid mist over entire crowds and reducing people to skeletons in seconds, and finally into a towering bipedal form for one last confrontation near Mount Fuji. That final fight is genuinely one of the ugliest, most one-sided beatings Godzilla ever takes on screen. When Godzilla punches through one of Hedorah's eyes, the creature's acidic blood burns the flesh clean off his hand down to the bone. Hedorah retaliates almost immediately by firing a chunk of its own corrosive body directly into one of Godzilla's own eyes, blinding him in kind. An eye-for-an-eye exchange traded in quick, brutal succession that leaves both monsters visibly maimed rather than simply staggered. A rarity for a franchise that usually reserves that level of graphic injury for its human cast rather than its titular monster. From there, Hedorah gains total control of the fight, hurling Godzilla into a pit and pumping it full of liquefied toxic sludge in a deliberate attempt to drown him outright, and very nearly succeeds, saved only by a last-second aerial bombing run from military helicopters dropping oxygen bombs to dry the creature's body out. Hedorah is remembered today mostly as the strange, druggy, environmentalist entry in the Showa catalog, but strip away the psychedelic visuals and what's left is one of the only fights in the entire franchise where Godzilla is genuinely, unambiguously losing, like right up until outside intervention saves him. The film doesn't shy away from just how one-sided that beating gets either. At one point, Hedorah simply knocks Godzilla down flat with a concentrated Hedrium light ray before shifting into its final, colossal form entirely, a size upgrade that leaves it physically larger than Godzilla for the remainder of the fight. A rare and deliberately humbling visual the franchise doesn't repeat often. Even human scientists in the film studying samples of Hedorah's blood conclude that raw firepower alone simply won't work against it, and that only extreme heat and complete dehydration stand any chance of finishing it off. A diagnosis that turns out to be exactly right, and one Godzilla himself has no way of pulling off without help. It's worth remembering, too, that Hedorah was Godzilla's first entirely non-Earth-based, non-mutant opponent, built specifically around a real-world environmental crisis rather than nuclear anxiety, arriving on screen right as Japan itself was reckoning publicly with the catastrophic industrial pollution of its own post-war boom, which gives the fight a documentary-adjacent weight most other Godzilla battles from the same decade never quite reach. For 17 years and 11 movies, nobody actually made Godzilla bleed, not even Hedorah with all its acid. He got knocked around, buried, electrocuted, but the guy never visibly bled on screen, not once since his debut in 1954. Then came 1972's Godzilla vs. Gigan, and a cyborg alien monster with hooked scythe-like claws and a literal chainsaw built into its stomach changed that permanently. That buzzsaw wasn't incidental set dressing either, but it remains one of the most physically unsettling weapons any Godzilla antagonist has ever been given. A spinning blade mounted directly onto the creature's own abdomen that it could bring to bear in close combat without ever needing to use its hands, turning ordinary body contact into a genuine threat in a way almost no other kaiju rival manages. Gigan wasn't introduced as some grand cosmic threat either. He was one half of a mercenary tag team hired by cockroach-like aliens disguised as humans, invading Earth to wipe out humanity and repopulate a planet they'd already polluted somewhere else. According to the lore built up around the character, Gigan wasn't even manufactured from scratch. He started life as a living space dinosaur, one that filled roughly the same apex predator role on his own homeworld that Godzilla fills on Earth, before the alien Nebulans killed him and rebuilt his corpse into a cybernetic weapon, grafting a beaked metal skull, hooked blade hands, and that infamous stomach-mounted buzzsaw onto whatever biological material still remained. Fighting alongside King Ghidorah on behalf of that alien invasion, Gigan took to the air, dodged Godzilla's atomic breath, and raked its abdominal buzzsaw across him in a pass that drew real, visible blood. The first time in franchise history, the king of the monsters had been physically wounded rather than just staggered. It happens again later in the same fight, with Gigan slicing Godzilla across the forehead this time, even after the alien mind control puppeting the fight has been shut down by a group of resourceful human characters sneaking dynamite into the enemy's control tower. Gigan and Ghidorah keep swinging purely out of old animal hatred for their earthly rivals, no orders required. Godzilla and his tag team partner Anguirus still win the battle, with Anguirus taking a nasty buzzsaw slash to the snout of his own along the way, but the damage was already historic. Gigan wasn't finished with Godzilla after that either. The following year, the same Nebulan alien sent him back to Earth in Godzilla vs. Megalon, this time teaming up with the Ceotopians' own guardian monster Megalon in a second attempt at conquest, only to be driven off again, this time by the combined efforts of Godzilla and the hastily upgraded robot hero Jet Jaguar. Even decades later, with foes like SpaceGodzilla, Destoroyah, and MonsterVerse's own King Ghidorah all racking up far scarier resumes, Gigan still holds a record none of them can claim: the very first monster to ever draw blood from Godzilla, and the film's reputation as the goofy, budget-strapped stock footage entry of the franchise almost undersells just how genuinely brutal that fight actually gets once the buzzsaw comes out. It's a reputation Gigan has quietly outlived his own movie's mixed critical standing to earn. A monster introduced as a discount weapon for cockroach aliens who still, more than half a century later, holds a distinction none of Godzilla's flashier, more prestigious rivals have managed to take from him. SpaceGodzilla. Most monsters that threaten Godzilla do it through raw strength. SpaceGodzilla did it by being smarter, colder, and considerably more personal about it. Formed when Godzilla's own cells drifted into space, passed through a black hole, and mutated into something crystalline and hateful. SpaceGodzilla arrived on Earth in 1994, already possessing full telepathy, force field generation, and an explosive corona beam he could steer mid-flight like a guided missile. Even his exact origin has never been pinned down with total certainty across the franchise's own internal materials. Some accounts describe Godzilla's cells simply drifting into a black hole and re-emerging transformed on the other side, while others tie the mutation more specifically to crystalline spores absorbed along the way, but every version agrees on the core detail that matters. SpaceGodzilla is genetically Godzilla's own flesh and blood, twisted into something that wants him dead. His design alone set him apart from every other rival Godzilla had faced up to that point. A bulkier, navy blue frame 20 meters taller than Godzilla himself, 2 massive white crystals erupting from his shoulders, and a body so overloaded with crystalline growth that he genuinely struggled to walk on land, compensating by simply flying everywhere instead. That silhouette wasn't designed from a blank slate either. Toho's artists modified an earlier design called SuperGodzilla, a powered-up transformation Godzilla himself took on in a 1993 Super Nintendo game of the same name, reworking those bulkier proportions into the fully three-dimensional, crystal-encrusted menace audiences got in theaters the following year. In their very first encounter, SpaceGodzilla didn't just beat Godzilla, he humiliated him, lifting him bodily off the ground using telekinesis alone, while Godzilla thrashed helplessly in the air, unable to land a single meaningful counterattack against an enemy who could simply hold him at arm's length with his mind. Godzilla had rushed into that fight to rescue his own adopted son, Little Godzilla, who SpaceGodzilla had already attacked first, and even that parental urgency wasn't enough to turn the tide once the telekinesis came into play. Then SpaceGodzilla did something no monster in the franchise had ever done before him. He went after Godzilla's family instead of Godzilla himself, snatching Godzilla's adopted son, Little Godzilla, and sealing him inside a crystal prison purely to draw his father out and torment him. The prison itself wasn't just decorative either. It kept Little Godzilla in a state of suspended animation for as long as SpaceGodzilla remained alive, meaning the threat against Godzilla's son didn't end the moment the kidnapping occurred, but persisted as a ticking hostage situation for the rest of the film, forcing Godzilla to divide his attention between destroying his rival and racing to free his own child. It's the first confirmed instance of a kaiju attacking Godzilla on a purely emotional level rather than a physical one, and it set the template Destoroyah would use again just 1 year later. Godzilla ultimately needed backup from the giant robot Moguera to finally bring SpaceGodzilla down, and even then it took a coordinated assault targeting the crystals on his shoulders, the one structural weakness on a foe who, in a straight fair fight, had already proven he could win. Even his eventual defeat plays out less like a triumphant victory and more like a war of attrition. Moguerra. Splitting apart into two separate units just to keep pace with him, while SpaceGodzilla's own overwhelming intelligence, unusual for a kaiju that mostly just wants to conquer and dominate rather than simply destroy, keeps him one step ahead of his opponents for most of the fight. Even after taking direct hits from both Godzilla's atomic breath and Moguera's combined firepower, it's specifically the destruction of the crystal formations on his own shoulders, the very structures that power his abilities, that finally brings him down, meaning SpaceGodzilla essentially has to be defeated by surgically dismantling the source of his own strength, rather than simply being outmuscled in a straight fight. Destoroyah. If SpaceGodzilla proved a monster could hurt Godzilla emotionally, Destoroyah proved one could actually finish the job. And the timing of its release, arriving just 1 year after SpaceGodzilla's own attempt, made 1995 an unusually brutal back-to-back stretch for Godzilla, even by the franchise's standards. Destoroyah is quite literally the physical embodiment of the oxygen destroyer, the same chemical weapon that killed the very first Godzilla back in 1954. Reawakened decades later when its lingering effects mutated a colony of ancient Precambrian crustaceans into something that could combine, evolve, and eventually converge into a single towering demonic kaiju. That connection to the original film's ending is what makes Destoroyah feel less like a new invention and more like unfinished business finally catching up. The very weapon humanity once used to save itself from Godzilla had been quietly incubating a monster capable of finishing that job all along, 41 years later. Unlike almost every other monster on this list, the franchise's own internal wiki entries are blunt about Destoroyah's psychology. Unlike creatures that destroy purely out of instinct, Destoroyah is fully aware of the suffering it causes and appears to actively enjoy it. What makes Destoroyah especially hard to actually kill is baked into its biology rather than its attitude. It isn't one creature so much as a colony that can splinter apart and recombine at will, moving through a full sequence of forms across the film. A microscopic stage that quietly kills fish in an aquarium tank, a swimming stage, a crawling juvenile stage, capable of shrugging off flamethrowers and rocket launchers, a combined aggregate form, a flying form, and finally its towering, bat-winged perfect form. Destroying any single stage doesn't actually finish it off, since the surviving colony members can simply scatter and start the whole process over again, which is part of why the JSDF struggles to put it down through conventional weapons for most of the film, watching flamethrowers and rocket launchers land direct hits only for the swarm to simply regroup somewhere else in the city moments later. That cruelty shows most clearly in how it treats Godzilla Jr. In their first exchange, its flying form batters the young Godzilla from the air, and even after Jr. lands a lucky shot that brings it down, the recombined aggregate form simply pins him beneath its own body weight and injects him directly with micro-oxygen, the same substance that once killed the original Godzilla. An attack Jr. actually survives, firing back hard enough to send Destoroyah tumbling away. It isn't until Destoroyah fully evolves into its towering, bat-winged perfect form that it finally finishes the job, snatching Jr. into the air, dropping him from a lethal height, and blasting him with a killing dose of micro-oxygen once he's down. The film goes out of its way to frame this as something more than simple monster violence, too. Destoroyah is shown appearing to laugh while dragging the wounded, grieving Godzilla by the neck in a later confrontation, one of the only moments in the entire franchise where a kaiju's cruelty reads as genuinely, deliberately sadistic, rather than purely animalistic. Grieving and enraged, the elder Godzilla, already teetering on the edge of a full nuclear meltdown from earlier events in the film, throws himself at Destoroyah anyway, and loses to it on multiple separate exchanges despite operating at what the story establishes as the very peak of his power. It ultimately takes a combined assault from Godzilla's own meltdown heat and the JSDF's experimental cryo-weapons to finally kill Destoroyah, and Godzilla himself doesn't survive the encounter either, dying from the meltdown shortly after, meaning Destoroyah remains the only kaiju in the franchise's history that can genuinely claim a direct hand in bringing an entire incarnation of Godzilla to an end. That death also introduced one of the most visually striking transformations Godzilla has ever undergone on screen. As his internal meltdown accelerates during the fight, his skin begins to glow and crack with visible fissures of pure nuclear light, a form the franchise's own materials refer to as burning Godzilla, and one so instantly iconic that Hollywood's own MonsterVerse borrowed a version of it decades later for Godzilla's climactic power-up against King Ghidorah. Even the manner of Destoroyah's own defeat underscores how close the whole fight actually was. Reports describe Destoroyah surviving multiple direct hits from its own red spiral atomic ray reflected back at it, an attack powerful enough to instantly cripple most other kaiju outright, and still getting back up to keep fighting, coughing up massive amounts of its own blood, but refusing to stay down until the cold finally did what raw firepower alone couldn't. Hit the like and subscribe button to see more videos like this. Leave a comment on which monster you think could actually beat Godzilla. Let's get back into the video. MonsterVerse King Ghidorah. Every previous Ghidorah in the franchise's 60-plus year history has eventually lost to Godzilla. The 2019 Legendary Pictures version came the closest anyone ever had to breaking that streak. Framed here as a genuinely alien invader rather than a mystical dragon, this Ghidorah spends most of Godzilla, king of the monsters, simply outclassing its rival, surviving a direct hit from a prototype missile called the Oxygen Destroyer that leaves Godzilla apparently dead, then regrowing an entire severed head in seconds once it's clear the coast is clear. This wasn't even Ghidorah's first attempt at conquering the planet. According to the film's own established backstory, Ghidorah invaded Earth in the ancient past long before recorded human history, only to be defeated and sealed away beneath the Antarctic ice by Godzilla and Mothra working together, meaning the events of the film aren't a first encounter so much as a long-delayed rematch, one monarch's eco-terrorists accidentally triggered by freeing Ghidorah from a prison two ancient titans had specifically built to contain it. That head regeneration alone was enough to convince Monarch, the film's monster monitoring organization, that they'd fundamentally misjudged what they were dealing with, having initially assumed Ghidorah was simply one more titan native to Earth's natural order rather than an invasive species from somewhere else entirely. Monarch's own internal research even goes a step further, noting that cranial scans of all three of Ghidorah's heads reveal divergent frontal lobe density between them, suggesting each head is capable of a genuinely independent level of thought and personality rather than simply acting as one mind split across three mouths, which makes the sheer coordination it shows in battle, directing separate heads to guard against separate threats simultaneously, all the more unnerving. When the two finally clash head-on in the film's climax, Ghidorah gains the upper hand by biting directly into a city power grid and drinking down the full electrical output, becoming powerful enough to genuinely overwhelm an already weakened Godzilla in a fight. The film frames without any ambiguity as Godzilla losing. Their allies fare no better in the background. Rodan, who'd already submitted to Ghidorah's rule earlier in the film, gets summoned back in to help pin down Mothra, and even Mothra herself, one of the franchise's most consistently protective guardian figures, ultimately gets struck down by Ghidorah's own laser breath while trying to shield the wounded Godzilla from a finishing blow. Watching Rodan flip sides so completely underscores just how thoroughly Ghidorah had already reshaped the entire Titan hierarchy before Godzilla ever got back into the fight. A formerly independent apex predator reduced to acting as a mere errand runner the moment a genuinely stronger alpha showed up to replace him. The only reason Godzilla survives at all is a two-part rescue. Dr. Serizawa sacrifices his own life detonating a nuclear warhead directly against Godzilla's body to restore his radiation levels, and Mothra gives her own life defending him moments later, her dying energy flowing directly into Godzilla and pushing him past his previous limits into a new form called Burning Godzilla. Strip away either of those two sacrifices, and Ghidorah wins outright. It remains the single closest any monster in the modern era has come to permanently ending Godzilla in a fair fight. And the aftermath somehow makes the whole encounter even more unsettling in hindsight. Years later, when Ghidorah's severed head is recovered and repurposed as the control core for an entirely different weapon, the alien's lingering consciousness turns out to still be active inside it, meaning even losing that final battle outright didn't fully put Ghidorah down, only delayed the reckoning by a few years and handed it a new body to try again in. MonsterVerse Mechagodzilla. Built by the corporation Apex Cybernetics as a mechanical doppelganger specifically engineered to kill Godzilla and end the Age of Titans altogether, Mechagodzilla was dangerous even under normal human control, requiring an entire secret Hollow Earth expedition just to source enough raw power to fully activate it in the first place, after Godzilla's own escalating rampages made conventional energy sources feel dangerously insufficient. That expedition wasn't a small side mission either. Apex partnered directly with Monarch, the very organization tasked with monitoring and protecting the Titans, tricking the scientific body into helping locate an energy source that would ultimately be used to build a weapon meant to wipe out the exact creatures Monarch existed to study, an act of corporate betrayal baked directly into Mechagodzilla's origin before it ever took a single step. It became something far worse the moment its creators made one catastrophic engineering mistake: wiring the machine's remote control system directly through the telepathic skull of the previous film's dead King Ghidorah, acquired years earlier from an eco-terrorist willing to sell it to the highest bidder. The moment Mechagodzilla was activated with a genuine power source pulled from the Hollow Earth, Ghidorah's lingering consciousness seized full control, electrocuted its own human pilot, killed its own creator with a single swipe, and burst free from its facility with the exact same murderous personality Ghidorah had displayed as a living monster. What followed very nearly succeeded where the original Ghidorah had failed. Mechagodzilla battered Godzilla with missiles, a devastating proton scream, and a drill-tipped hand, pushing him to the brink. And the film's own internal lore is direct about the outcome. Mechagodzilla very nearly destroyed Godzilla outright, and likely would have, had Kong not arrived to even the odds. At one point in the fight, Mechagodzilla is shown physically lifting and hurling Godzilla with a single hand, a display of raw, effortless strength that no purely organic titan in the MonsterVerse's roster had managed to match against him up to that point, human engineering briefly outmuscling 70 years of nature's own strongest creation. Kong himself doesn't escape the encounter unscathed either. This incarnation of Mechagodzilla is counted among only a small handful of foes in the franchise's entire modern history to bring the giant ape himself to the brink of death in the same fight, making it a rare threat capable of nearly finishing off two Apex Titans simultaneously in a single-handed rampage. It ultimately took both Titans working together, Godzilla charging Kong's axe with atomic breath so Kong could physically cleave the machine apart to bring Mechagodzilla down, making it one of only a handful of threats in the franchise's history that legitimately required a 2-on-1 effort just to survive. Monarch itself would later classify the machine as genuinely biomechanical rather than purely artificial, and for good reason. Its frame incorporated actual organic material recovered from a deceased Titan carcass alongside Ghidorah's own severed skull, meaning Mechagodzilla wasn't simply a robot wearing Godzilla's silhouette, but something closer to a stitched-together hybrid of dead monster tissue and cutting-edge human engineering. What makes the machine even scarier in hindsight is how little of its true potential the humans piloting it ever actually understood. Apex built the perfect anti-Godzilla weapon and then handed unwitting control of it to the one consciousness in the entire world guaranteed to turn that weapon against everyone, Godzilla included, the very first chance it got. Apex had reportedly even built a self-destruct mechanism into the machine for exactly this kind of emergency, a failsafe meant to stop Mechagodzilla if it ever went rogue. And once Ghidorah's consciousness actually seized control, that safeguard simply never got the chance to be used. Orga. Most monsters on this list threatened Godzilla with force. Orga threatened him with erasure. Orga began life as a collective of ancient alien millennials, photosynthetic beings who'd been dormant on Earth for 60 million years before waking up and attacking Godzilla directly from inside a rocky UFO shaped to look almost like a natural meteorite. Before ever becoming Orga, this Millennian collective actually tried reasoning with Godzilla first, attempting communication rather than immediately resorting to violence. A level of diplomacy essentially no other name on this list ever bothers to extend toward Godzilla, and one that makes its eventual transformation into a mindless, consuming monster feel less like villainy and more like a genuine tragedy. When that ship absorbed a sample of Godzilla's own regenerative organizer G1 cells, the aliens inside it fused and mutated into something never meant to exist. A hulking, single-minded creature with one goal wired into it: fully assimilate Godzilla's DNA and become a perfect replacement for him. Orga wasn't a graceful fighter. It landed exactly one punch in the entire battle and spent most of the fight dodging and absorbing damage rather than dishing it out, but its healing factor matched Godzilla's own regeneration speed almost exactly, meaning every wound Godzilla managed to open sealed itself again within seconds, turning Godzilla's usual overwhelming firepower advantage into something closer to a stalemate. Before ever engaging Godzilla in that final confrontation, Orga also bit directly into its own arm and absorbed additional genetic material from the wound, an act of self-mutilation performed purely to accelerate its own transformation into a more perfect copy of Godzilla, showing just how single-mindedly the creature was willing to damage itself in pursuit of a goal it barely seemed to understand. Orga even displayed a strange flicker of intelligence in the middle of the chaos, telepathically summoning its own crashed UFO back into the fight to physically absorb an incoming blast of Godzilla's atomic breath before it could land, buying itself precious extra time to keep pursuing its actual goal. Realizing brute force wasn't working, Orga escalated to the most direct possible method of victory. It unhinged its jaw and began swallowing Godzilla whole, head first, in an attempt to absorb him completely from the inside out. It very nearly worked. Godzilla only survives by letting the swallowing happen on purpose, using the moment of being fully engulfed to detonate a devastating nuclear pulse from inside Orga's own throat, blowing the creature's entire upper body apart from within. That final gambit only worked because Godzilla recognized what Orga was actually trying to do and turned the creature's own strategy into a trap, choosing to walk directly into a mouth built to erase him rather than keep trading blows, in a fight his healing factor matched opponent could theoretically drag out indefinitely. It's the only monster on this list that came within seconds of literally erasing Godzilla by consuming him. Orga's appetite for consumption didn't end with that single film either. Later comic continuations of the character, published well after Godzilla 2000, Millennium reimagined Orga surviving in some form as an out-of-control brute obsessed with devouring literally anything it encounters, reportedly even attempting to swallow Gigan whole in one particularly chaotic crossover story. A fitting afterlife for a monster whose entire defining trait, even in its very first appearance, was trying to eat its way into becoming something else entirely. There's a strange, almost tragic irony buried in Orga's origin too. The Millennians weren't inherently violent or power-hungry before absorbing Godzilla's cells. They were simply a stranded, ancient species trying to survive on an unfamiliar planet, and it was that single moment of contact with Godzilla's own regenerative biology that warped them into a monster obsessed with nothing but replacing him entirely. 7 different monsters, 7 completely different methods: corrosive sludge, a buzzsaw, a mind, a genocidal parasite, a stolen power grid, a dead rival's ghost wired into a machine, and a mouth big enough to swallow him whole. And every single one of them found a real on-screen moment where Godzilla was losing. What almost every name on this list has in common is that Godzilla never actually beat them through strength alone. He needed an ally's sacrifice, a lucky structural weakness, or a partner willing to fight beside him. Even the timeline itself tells a story worth noticing. From Hedorah's acid in 1971 to Mechagodzilla's proton scream 50 years later, almost every genuine near-death experience Godzilla has ever suffered on screen came from something built or born specifically to exploit whatever made him strongest in the first place. His own radiation, his own cells, his own family, or, in Mechagodzilla's case, his own exact shape turned into a weapon and pointed back at him. That's arguably the real through line connecting every entry on this list. Godzilla's signature power, the thing that makes him the king of the monsters to begin with, is also consistently the exact vulnerability his deadliest rivals learn to turn against him. It's also worth noting how rarely any of these confrontations actually stay settled for good. Ghidorah's consciousness outlived its own defeat inside a stolen skull. SpaceGodzilla and Orga were both born from Godzilla's own cells escaping his control in the first place. Even Destoroyah traces its entire existence back to a weapon humanity built decades earlier to save itself, only for that same weapon's lingering effects to spawn something new and hostile all over again. Godzilla's rivals, more often than not, aren't strangers arriving from nowhere. They're consequences of his own existence catching up with him one film at a time. Which of these do you think comes closest to actually finishing the job? Drop it in the comments.